Well, hi everyone, and thanks for coming today. Welcome to our panel discussion today. My name is Lloyd Rang. I'm the narrative lead for Curious Public, and I'll be your host today. And through the course of this discussion, I'm pleased to see folks are already using the chat on the side there. Please feel free to put comments and questions in the chat as we go on. I'd like to introduce our panel today. First, I'll start with John Wilkinson. John is a member of the board of directors for Greenfield Global, which is the largest ethanol biofuel producer in Canada. And he's on a number of corporate, charitable, and not-for-profit boards. John was also Ontario's Minister of Research and Innovation, Minister of Revenue, and Minister of the Environment. Welcome, John. Next, Sarah Petrovan. Sarah is the VP of Sustainability at the Cement Association of Canada. She has worked as a policy director for Clean Energy Canada and as director of public affairs for Friends of the Greenbelt. And she was also the chief of staff and director of communications in the Ontario government. And last but certainly not least, Aaron Freeman. Aaron is the owner of Pivot Strategic Consulting, and Aaron helps clients solve environmental problems through public policy. He's also the founder of GreenPAC, which is Canada's organization to build environmental leadership in politics. And he's also a former law professor specializing in public governance law. That's our panel for today as we begin our discussion. And once again, thanks to our panelists for joining us today, and welcome to all of you. So before we start, I just want to set the table a little bit and just talk about what our topic of conversation is today. A few decades ago, companies decided it was going to be in their best interest to market their products or practices as sustainable or eco-friendly because environmentally conscious consumers demanded them. For example, McKinsey reported that 60% of consumers said they pay more for products that had sustainable packaging. So it's a popular choice, and there are of course excellent products on the market, that are made from recycled materials or biodegradable, have a small environmental footprint, and so forth. Some are labeled that way and are not any of those things. And some businesses that market themselves as environmentally sound are not. And that's what's called greenwashing. It's about making unsubstantiated claims to deceive consumers and investors. And it tricks people into believing that a company's products are environmentally friendly or have a greater environmental positive impact than they actually do. So the question is, how do consumers and investors tell the difference? And as communicators, what's our role in promoting best practices? So today, we're going to talk about some new global sustainability standards that are designed to stem the tide of greenwashing, and we'll get into that in a bit. But first, let's just talk about where we're at or where we've been at in terms of how companies are able to talk about sustainability. So we'll start with John. John, you want to talk a little bit about what companies have been able to say about their products or services until now when it comes to sustainability? And what has happened? Has there been any penalty to companies that bend the truth other than maybe bad press?
Well, thanks for having me on, and it's great to be joining Aaron and Sarah. My first comment would be companies have been able to say whatever the hell they want. Right? It has been a wild, wild west out there. And there are numerous standards around the world, locally, nationally, globally. Companies can kind of agglomerate to that and just say that's their reason for their product claim. First thing I'd say is everybody says they're sustainable. Nobody agrees what that is, but there is a definition of what is sustainable. Something is sustainable if it's good for people, a planet, and profit. In a business setting, it has to be good for the business, but it also has to be good for the environment, and it also has to be good for the community. And if you don't pass that three-way test, you're not sustainable. You may be green, but you're not sustainable. And so that's the first thing. So I tell people who are in communications, if you're banding around the term sustainability, you may want to make sure that you're actually being accurate about that. The greatest example of greenwashing that's out there, the textbook case that they teach at all the biz schools, is Volkswagen, which was one of the largest auto manufacturers in the world, if not the largest. And what happened is they like diesel engines because they're German. They invented them. And diesel engines are pretty energy efficient and they got great power, but they pollute like crazy. And so what Volkswagen came up with was clean diesel. All of their engines were going to be clean diesel. And they say, so the government imposed all of these emission standards, all of their cars passed the standard. And they were selling these cars around the world, millions of them. And then a couple of researchers kind of questioned how this was kind of breaking the laws of thermodynamics. And then a whistleblower inside of Volkswagen said, actually, we didn't make a better engine. We just figured out how to trick the emissions testing software. In the United States alone, that cost Volkswagen $14.7 billion in penalty. I think in Canada, one of their penalties was $200 million. But in the EU, which is where they make most of their cars and sell most of them, 10 million cars, they had to agree so that they wouldn't be put into bankruptcy. They had to agree to lead the European Union in electric cars. So by 2025, they have to have 30 electric models. That's their penalty. So greenwashing happens, but if you get caught, it costs you a lot of money in reputation, in money, and it can threaten the survival of your company.
So I'll turn to Sarah then. So Sarah, like, do you sort of agree with this assessment? Like, are companies truly penalized by the market? And secondly, does this impact your work as VP of Sustainability for the Cement Association of Canada?
So, I mean, the good news is that if anybody's getting penalized, it's nobody in the cement industry, because we are amongst the global leaders in heavy industry in actually trying to deliver and delivering plans that are credible, that are verified. Like most of our member companies internationally have science-based verified emissions reduction targets. The Canadian cement industry last spring released their NetZero to 2050 plan, and we're the only industry that has actually put out data on how we're going to do that. So in addition to targets, where are those emissions reductions coming from? How will we get them? How is our fuel mix going to change? What kind of technologies are we going to use? And we did that all based on existing available technologies. We didn't park or kick the can down the road and say, well, there might be this magic unicorn solution that shows up 5 years from now, and then everything will be fine. No, we're saying based on what's available today, what we can do today, this is how we're going to do it. And I think that it's really important, right? There's a lot that gets lost in marketing and communications claims. Those claims have to be backed up by data. They have to be backed up by transparency. And if anybody's not being transparent and they're not providing the data and they're just giving you a marketing and communications claim, you really have to ask then what's behind that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And Aaron, so you're a policy expert. So these companies that have sort of made these loose claims around sustainability, that doesn't happen in a vacuum. So has there been sort of a lack of regulatory oversight or lack of applicable policies that have allowed this sort of greenwashing to exist in some industries and left it to industries like the Cement Association, for example, to just kind of follow best practices on their own?
Well, there has, and it's not actually in the business's interest to have that vacuum. So if you look at the Volkswagen example that John just talked about, it's not in business's interest to rely for the accountability mechanism being to get caught. That doesn't provide any kind of certainty for businesses. And it doesn't provide a level playing field for the leaders. There's always going to be leaders and laggards in the business world. There will always be business advantages for a company to be seen as doing the right thing. And there will always be limits beyond which it becomes too risky or expensive for a company to go there. And this actually ties back to Sarah's example of the cement companies. A lot of the time, what cement companies are looking for is give us a level playing field. We think that we've got a good product here that is good on a life cycle assessment when you look at carbon, for example, but you've got we can't compete if those costs and benefits are not taken into account when you make infrastructure decisions, for example.
Mm.
So that's really the role of government, is to try to level that playing field, move the range of what's possible in the market further towards sustainability by doing that. And if you level the playing field so that the sustainability leaders aren't placed at a competitive disadvantage to the laggards, and the laggards can't use their lousy environmental record to increase their profits, that's really that can't be done by the market alone. So it's really important. I mean, sometimes this involves government just getting out of the way. That's sort of the common refrain about the role of government, but far more often, it really means regulation and standard setting. The public assumes that if government is allowing certain practices to continue in the market, that practice is acceptable. So when a company makes a false claim about environmental performance and the government fails to take any action against that company, it's lending credibility to those false claims. If a government provides subsidies to that kind of a company, or it purchases its products or services, or when the government fails to identify a practice or a product that's harmful to the environment, all of these things lend credibility and encourage greenwashing.
So, I mean, it's I guess another analogy is it's like the current rules are sort of like playing tennis without a net, and it doesn't benefit any of the players on the field to have a lack of structure in the regulatory and policy environment. So that's actually a really good segue into my next question, which is about something that's got John pretty revved up by now, and I'll let John start off with this, which are these new international sustainability standards. And so what are those new standards, John? What's going on in the environment right now?
Well, the first thing is the analogy about in business. What we're all used to is financial statements. If I want to borrow money, if I want to attract investment, then I have to say to the bank or to the potential investor, or if I want to be in business with somebody else, I have to share my financial statements. Okay, well, financial statements are not based on good faith. Financial statements are audited by an independent accounting firm who puts their name and says, we check the financial statements and the profit and loss and the asset and the liabilities and the use of cash flow based on these international standards are correct. Doesn't matter whether your financial statements are in Canada or in Slovenia, there is an international standard that accounting auditing firms use, and it's called the International Financial Reporting Standard. Now, these same companies in this world of climate change, for example, are making all of these sustainability claims. And so they've come together and created two new standards in regard to sustainability reporting. One has to do with financial information, how you're presenting the financial impact of your sustainability efforts, and also how you're making disclosures in regard to climate. And so what I've told our friends in the communications business is this is changing the world. Instead of this whole wild, wild west and alphabet soup of all of these different things, the thing that will be common is that companies will have to accurately and verifiably account for the claims that they are making. And if they don't do that, then their financial statements will not be signed off by the auditors, and therefore they will not be able to borrow money. They won't be able to do business with other companies. They won't be able to attract investors. And so communications people at companies know, especially if they're publicly traded, that they may want to put out a press release, but it goes by the CFO and the legal department first, because you're not allowed to make statements that are false. And so that same rigor is now going to be applied to statements that companies are making about their sustainability practices. And that, I think, going back to Aaron's point, is that, first of all, it allows companies that are members of Sarah's organization to have the advantage, because they've done all the hard work. They can actually prove it to an independent third party. So what the work they're doing is auditable. To government, companies can say, government can figure out the wheat from the chaff, the leaders versus the laggards, and about where policy is. And investors and bankers and other businesses can rely on a company that the statements that they're making are factually correct. And Lloyd, up until now, there has been no standard to which we could hold companies that they are actually being factually correct. And so I think that's just a sea change, because this is going to be applied right around the world. And there's very similar standards that are used for privately owned companies as well. If they're borrowing money, if they're in business with other companies, if they're attracting investors, they're going to have to meet this standard.
So thinking about publicly traded companies for a second, then I imagine Volkswagen stock took a hit after the scandal, right?
They almost went bankrupt.
So this would provide some security for investors too, right? So if you've got companies and people like us who have RSPs and things like that, so if you've got these stocks in your portfolio, this creates a bit more certainty around them not doing something that would kick them out of the market potentially as well, right?
Absolutely, that's the whole idea. Business is based on the fact that the representations you're making about your financial position are not made up.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not, well, trust me, Lloyd, trust me if you want to do business with my company, or trust me, Sarah, if you want to lend me money, that this is how I represent myself.
Yeah.
It's not just what I'm saying. It's gone to an auditor who's independent of me, who's looked at it based on standards and said, yeah, his profit is his profit, his loss is his loss, his assets are his assets, his liabilities are his liabilities, and this is how he's using his cash.
So then
Same thing now with sustainability.
So then is there for communications professionals then, like we're used to running things by legal and that sort of thing. So is there an extra step in this process now for all of us when we're going out and communicating on behalf of our organizations? I mean, is the due diligence, does it land on us? Is it ultimately somebody else's responsibility? What's the role of communications in ensuring that when we go out, we're telling the truth?
Well,
I would say, like, I think it's the same thing like you would for any other media statement you put out. Like, the people that are in charge of the companies, be it the CFOs, the vice presidents of sustainabilities, like your management has to sign off on these things. And it's important to know, like, you can't, just as you can't go out making financial claims that aren't true, you now can't go out and make sustainability claims that aren't true. And so, okay, it's incumbent on the communications person, as it is incumbent on everybody in the entire company and the senior leadership of the company, to make sure that these claims are verified before they go out, or else there will be penalties. And, like, bring it on. It's about time that we did these sorts of things. I think it's excellent.
So, well, and that's a good segue to your work too. So are you as an association adapting to meet these standards? Do you already meet them? Does this cause any concern for you at all?
So not concerned at all. All of our member companies are part of large multinationals, with science-based verified emissions reduction targets, in line with the Task Force on Climate-related Financial Disclosures. And so I imagine for those companies, it will be a very easy step to incorporate these new standards into their reporting. Many of our parent companies are amongst global leaders in sustainability. One of them won't do capital investment anymore unless that facility has a net zero pathway. You have another member that's trying to build the world's first net zero cement plant, and they're trying to do it in Canada, which is pretty cool. So, I'm very fortunate, and I think I have a really, in some ways, a very easy job in that, my members look to the association to say, like, how can we do more? On the association level, obviously, like, sustainability is the core, one of the most core strategic focuses that we have. Probably in our own operations, we have a little bit of work to do, particularly on our Scope 3 emissions. I think probably we really have to think about how we do our travel, but we've put our hands up and said, like, we're ready to lead, and we're ready to lead in Canada, just as the industry is leading internationally. And so, excited for these standards. I don't suspect there'll be a trouble for us at all.
I guess and that's great to hear. I mean, I guess I'm thinking as somebody who does media training occasionally with companies now, it might be something that we slide into media training to just check with spokespeople for the company that they're not freelancing around some of these claims that because, like when you're in a media interview or something like that, as a comms professional, as a spokesperson, you might, occasionally slip up and make a claim that might be baseless. So it's one of those things that I think as we train professionals, it's something to think about, right? It's another round of questions for sure. So that's the publicly traded. So I'm going to turn over to Aaron for a sec. And so is there any impact on NGOs and nonprofits and indigenous organizations and other folks that you might work with, like SMEs, that sort of thing?
Yeah, I mean, we work with a lot of those are the sectors that we work in. And I think that just going back to a lot of this goes back to the discussion around leaders and laggards. And there's a really important interplay between a sustainability leader and government, in that the leader demonstrates what's possible in the sector. And that gives license to government to go further, whether it's through regulation or policy or funding, or other form of government policy. The ISSB and the other standards can provide a great model for organizations in the advocacy organizations and others to demonstrate to government what's possible in terms of policy. And we see that all the time. I mean, when you look at LEED building standards, for example, they've really set the bar for government. And over time, they have found their way directly and indirectly into model building codes. So what we see is the standards being adopted by the leaders end up defining the minimum standards for the laggards. And over time, that's a really important dynamic that influences policy.
So do you think there's an adoption cost as just a follow-on question, but is there an adoption cost to this for companies? Like if you're used to not following sustainable practices, is there going to be like is this additive to companies in a way?
Well, my first comment would be it's competitive, right? So the marketplace is competitive. So you have to decide if you're going to be a leader or a laggard, or just try to skate by in the middle. That's just a strategic question you're going to have to deal with. And you're not going to be able to say in the new world, oh, well, the other guys are claiming that, but it's really not true. If they're claiming it and there is these new accounting standards that are enforced around the world, they're not going to be making the claim unless it is true. And so you'll be able to kind of separate the leaders from the laggards.
I think the competitive advantage piece, though, that John touched on, like that's really, really important. My member companies care very much about the environment, but let's also be clear, like a lot of their environmental ambition is also about keeping and maintaining a competitive advantage in an increasingly carbon constrained world, because whether it be Inflation Reduction Act policy that's like driving investment like crazy south of the border, or European Green New Industrial deals, emerging trade agreements around lower and lower carbon materials, like it is very clearly where the trajectory of business is going. And so, I agree, like for a long time, the leaders have been sort of operating at a bit of a disadvantage because we've gone farther than perhaps what government or what the market is willing to bear. So, for example, it is technologically possible to have net zero cement today, but nobody's buying it. So, now that these standards start to come into place, I think that we're going to start seeing, sure, companies catch up with each other, but now maybe the role of government policy and market incentives being there to kind of, take us all one step further.
So that actually leads, you mentioned government, and we're all political veterans here. So I just a thought occurred to me then, if you're applying standards to business, is government going to be under increased scrutiny around things like you mentioned travel earlier and that sort of thing? Are government leaders now going to, because they're holding industry and they're going to be and because the market is going to be holding the private sector more accountable, is the public sector now going to have to take a look at its work and really start asking questions about sustainability and their own practices?
Well, if they want to be credible, they do. Right. In other words, if you're imposing the rules, you lack credibility if you don't actually follow the rules yourself. I mean,
Mhm,
it's why governments have independent auditors themselves, right?
mhm.
So that the public can be assured that government action in regard to how they're dealing with the finances of the jurisdiction are correct. So they have to hold themselves up to the same standards. Companies have to be subject to audit, so are governments. If governments are going to impose sustainability standards, it's going to apply to them as well.
Wonder if we'll see a sustainability auditor in the future in government. That'd be interesting.
Well, I think you will be. I mean, governments, depending on their stripe, many governments in the world have said that they're going to reduce their carbon footprint.
Mhm,
And the society has to do that. The UK, for example, just yesterday started rolling back some of their promises, while you have other governments in the world that are moving ahead.
mhm,
So they themselves, Lloyd, are making claims.
mhm,
At least now there's this new international standard that applies. And I said, Aaron was talking about SMEs. The large companies, by and large, are supplied by small companies. So when the large company has to meet this new standard, then smaller companies who are their suppliers have to meet their standard because they're not going to buy a product that's going to mess up their financial statements. And so there is this kind of, there will be, even though a company may not be captured right away, it's the same thing about you have a company like Walmart deciding to be net zero. What it forces them to do is they say to all their suppliers, well, we have to be net zero. So for our scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, we need you to be net zero. And
mhm.
so there's that movement from the top down to actually get companies to move in the right direction.
So it's I'll move on to the next question. And Aaron, you mentioned LEED certification. I remember when LEED certification first came out and nobody knew what it was. And now I would say, I would say it's entered, maybe not public parlance, but I think it's certainly a much better known certification standard than it once was. So thinking about the ISSB standards, they're going to be open to investors and they'll be public record. But is that going to filter down now to the consumer level, in your opinion? Like, in other words, will the average Canadian know when to call BS on a claim? And will they be following this standard, or will it trickle down to the consumer level? I'll start with you, Aaron. What's your thought on that?
Well, the short answer is no. I mean, the average Canadian needs organizations, institutions, and government bodies who can validate these claims, and that's the reason why verification, accountability, independent monitoring is so important with all of these standards. This has been a real problem in the forestry sector, where there are at least a couple of standards developed by industry that are significantly weaker than standards like the Forest Stewardship Council, which has much stronger buy-in from environmental and indigenous voices. But the average consumer is kind of stuck trying to decipher which of these certifications has merit. So you really do need that. You need some reference points. The consumer needs reference points to make sure that these standards actually can actually pass muster. Government can play a role in that by adopting the stronger standards as a model for other purchasers, but also by weighing in on some of the spurious sustainability claims. And it would be very interesting, I think, to put this in the context of the current attempts by government to reform the Competition Act. There's a lot of interest in building the capacity for government to use that act to address greenwashing that constitutes false advertising, to broaden the ambit of what they would consider false advertising in that regard. And environmental groups have been playing a leading role in that by filing complaints that are proceeding against fossil fuel companies, for example, that are being accused of making those kinds of claims.
Hmm. Hmm. So Sarah, any reaction to that? Just any thoughts from your end?
I mean, I think it's great that some of these false claims are now starting to be questioned. In addition to some members of the oil and gas industry, some of these forestry standards have been put before the Competition Bureau, again because false advertising, false claims, questions about their sustainability, And I think, we saw like this huge trend towards ESG, but now there's a whole bunch of legal claims getting backed against ESG to say, wait a minute, like these are false claims. And it's created like an awakening of sorts around, what is needed. And the more that government can require transparency and accountability, I think the better off we all are, because like, let's also remember, standards are important, but like government is a market actor. Sure, it's the public sector, but it has the ability to sit there and say, okay, well, no, like, we spend X billions of dollars on infrastructure every year, and we're not going to buy things that aren't sustainable anymore for that construction, because actually now we're seeing all sorts of emerging problems coming around, carbon intensity of building materials. So like, how much pollution are we putting out into the world? But then also like, how resilient are these structures that we're building against climate related disasters, right? We had more forest fires in Canada this year than we've ever had in recent memory, I believe. And, and now those things are all starting to call into question.
So that leads to an interesting question. We kind of touched on this a little bit, and I'll stay on you for this one, Sarah, because you've got some experience with this. But so, in terms of the capacity of communications departments to be able to handle, like to be able to understand, because now we're asking comms professionals to know about a whole other thing, right? So. And you've had some experience with this because you've had to, you as an association, you've been leading the way in this comms charge to a certain extent. So what's your advice for comms professionals who are working in industry and other organizations? Like, what do they need to know? What needs to change? Is there an education piece? Is there a capacity piece here? Is there a process piece? Like, how do we stay as nimble as we can be to keep up with all this?
Yeah, so I think it's important in any industry, like don't live on an island, right? Like communications professionals are part of, a dedicated and often very senior management team in an organization or in an association. And so like I would never expect my communications colleagues to know everything, but they know that they can call me. And so, it's about developing a collaborative approach to, what's our message? What can we say? Is it okay that we say this, Sarah? Or, how do we recommend we change that? I think it means that, while we need to be nimble and we need to continue to be nimble, we also have to work together. And it's the same as working with a, chief financial officer or working with a CEO. The sustainability leads are now playing an increasing role in the public face of a company, and it's becoming, an increasingly more important role in organizations, whether it be mine or whether it be a private company.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I think as true as that is, Sarah, internally within the company, the main validation can't come from the company. Like nobody's going to believe you.
No.
So you need supporting validation through things like standard setting, government policy, and independent organizations. And that's not to say that the company can't have legitimate disagreements with these bodies or standards, but that shouldn't override the need to support these entities, because your credibility requires some form of truly external validation.
So and that's powerful, because I may disagree with my auditors about my financial statements, but they're going to win the argument, because if the auditors don't sign off on the financial statements, then I cannot use them to talk to investors, to talk to other businesses, or to talk to banks. And that's the international standard. And that's the key thing. You have companies like in Sarah's industry, which are international. Now, for all of them, they have this new level playing field. That helps them. That helps them make an investment in Canada. Because if they're going to be leading in Canada as a corporation, they're going to be recognized everywhere around the world. There won't be kind of cherry picking of standards and what we're going to be part of. And the advice I give with communications professionals is you got to think like a journalist, and you have to ask questions internally before you start making an announcement.
Mhm.
There were so many companies, when we had this after Paris in 2015, the Paris Accord, everybody said they're going to be net zero by 2050. And because a company said that, all the competitors, the CEO said, geez, our competitor just said they're going to be net zero by 2050. So I better say that. And nobody asked the question, well, what does it mean to be net zero by 2050? And so what would a journalist ask? Oh, so you're going to be net zero by 2050. Well, what are your emissions today? Oh, we don't know. So you don't know where you are, but you've decided where you're going to be. That doesn't sound very business-like. So, oh, well, here's our emissions and how we're going to get. Well, how are you going to get there? So what are emissions going to be 3 years from now?
Mhm.
Right? So this whole idea in business, I mean, you set goals and you achieve those goals, you're held accountable for those goals. And that's what I tell communications professionals. You need to push back to make sure that you personally are not responsible for preparing statements that are going out to the public which do not pass this sniff test. And it's up to you to push back. And the key thing you need to know is pretty soon it's going to be reversed. The CFO of that company is not going to allow you to say anything unless he or she agrees, because they have to put their name and their public accounting license on that statement, which goes out to the marketplace. So
So
there's a real change of dynamic.
one of the challenges with this for communications professionals is that a lot of this information is complex, right? So when you're dealing with a specialized industry like cement, for example, it requires you to understand a lot about, as a communications person, requires you to understand a lot about the nature of the business itself, and it can get very detailed. So, and that does not translate well to communications products, because the like, what's clinker, for example? I just happen to know this because I've studied cement. So I think it's incumbent on comms professionals to do the thing that we used to do in government, which is go to the policy expert, go to the subject matter expert and say, okay, I'm going to sit down and interview you right now and ask you, what does this mean exactly? And then you're going to give me a long, complicated answer, and I'm going to try to simplify it in a way that would make sense to the average layperson. And then I'll verify it with you and say, okay, so Aaron, what I hear you saying is this. Does that make sense? And when Aaron says, yes, you can say it that way, I in turn say, that's brilliant. Can I say that? And then Aaron signs off on it, and that becomes the communications product. And that way the subject matter expert has input into the final message, and they think they came up with the beautiful comms product, but it's actually the comms person that did the translation. So I think it's really, I think that little Jedi mind trick that we sometimes play with the subject matter experts as comms people is something that we need to keep in mind for this as well, because it can be very complex. And I think in terms of building that capacity, it's going to be, it's just another step in the process that we're going to have to think of as comms people. So I wonder too, just sort of the last thing to kind of wrap up this section is, so is there an opportunity here for companies to get ahead, to get ahead of the curve a little bit? And there's Matt in the questions here has said, North America is very behind Europe. Is there an opportunity here for North American companies to sort of, like we talked about, leveling the playing field, to kind of jump into where some of these European companies are at, to kind of take a market leadership position here in North America?
The EU is the leading jurisdiction in the world on all of this. If you want to know where the puck's going to be in North America, you have to pay attention to what's happening in Europe on all of these factors. Now, one of the things when you make statements is Europe has developed the first taxonomy in the world. A taxonomy is just everybody agreeing what is the definition of something, right? That's a taxonomy. So when you say net zero, or you're talking about GHGs, like, they actually have already agreed these terms mean this. If you use these terms improperly, that is fraud, right? So now the government has this taxonomy that says, okay, you make these statements, but if you're using these words and these phrases, they had better mean this, because if we find out they don't, that is fraud. Just like the same claims as Aaron was saying about the Competition Bureau. If you're making these claims about your product and using these words, they better mean that, because if not, that's prima facie, that is fraud. And that the first jurisdiction in the world to do that is the EU. So again, that is my advice always is if you're a sustainability professional, pay attention to what's going on at the EU because it's going to be happening here sooner or later, and most likely sooner.
I mean, I think it's more of an opportunity for North America to catch up rather than it is for us to be leaders. But let's not be disappointed by that, right? Like there's huge value in catching up, not only from the environmental benefit, but also from the economic benefit as well. And I'm sitting there thinking about like what advice would I give to communications professionals, or what advice would I give to a sustainability person at a company or even in an association. And I think my slogan for this like session is gonna say be impeccable. Like you have to be impeccable on your numbers, but you also have to be impeccable on your communications materials. You have to do the work. So the sustainability people have to do the carbon accounting, and the communications people have to 100% understand what they're talking about and making sure that they're saying the right things. And this can happen, right? They do it for financials. Like as John said, we do all of this kind of stuff for financial responsibility at companies. And now we are just adding on a sustainability component. It's manageable, it's doable, and it's important.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I think
What?
from the from the standpoint of both the sustainability experts, and we've got now over the last decade a huge growth in that sector. We've professionalized the huge swaths of sustainability. We're now embedded in the leadership of these companies at a VP level and so on. So both at that level and at the comms level, the temptation is to, and the risk here is that we turn this process, especially as it's evolving so quickly, and as many in North America are playing catch up, we turn it into a box checking exercise. And this can be a function of trying to turn something that is quite complex, right? You're talking about sustainability that incorporates equity, diversity, inclusion, human health, a whole range of other areas. The temptation there is we need to simplify it. And that can turn into that kind of box checking exercise. If you look at the many different sustainability ranking systems, for example, and you look at a big corporation and where they rank in those systems, it's all over the place, depending on which ranking system you're looking at. The same company gets a dramatically different score depending on which ranking system you're looking at. And quite often, those who come out on not so much the higher end, but the mid to higher end of those rankings, they're there because they file the right reports, they publish the right statements. It's sort of the corporate equivalent to teaching to the test, checking the box to make sure that they're bumping up their score. So we're upping the level of capacity and skill being applied to sustainability, but the skill set often doesn't go beyond that kind of box checking exercise. The leaders are those that ensure that the company practices are making a real difference in the world, and the communication narrative has to tell that story in ways that are both quantifiable and genuine.
So, I mean, this sounds lovely, in theory, but like the question was about North America versus Europe, right? And so if I look at the two places in the world, I see marked differences in the way that we operate. So the political environment in North America, generally a little bit more, I mean, there's exceptions, but a little bit more conservative than in Europe, say, which, you've got politicians who, when companies want to make sustainability moves, are calling them woke, right? There's been a conservative backlash in the States against companies that are adopting sustainability practices. Then you've got consumer differences, like consumers in Europe, I think, are much more conditioned to purchase sustainably. And again, there could be a counter reaction to that, consumers rolling coal instead of buying electric. And then you've got communications differences, cultural differences. I mean, I'm Dutch. I mean, if I look at ads in the Netherlands versus ads in the communication, like it's much more factual. It's a bit dry, actually, or frankly, kind of weird sometimes. But communications is very differently practiced in the Netherlands versus in Canada. So can we do, like, can we do this, or are we going to be set up to fail in that we've always done it this way? We've got powerful interests that are moving us away from sustainability in certain places in North America, and consumers aren't necessarily up to it, and the comms environment is different. I mean, is it are we just too different, to Matt's point, from Europe to be able to manage this?
Well, Lloyd, I would say no, because business is business, and businesses are designed to make money. And when you look at the definition of sustainability, what it says is, to be a company, it's not enough just to make money, because you have to make money. That's the whole purpose, right? We don't go into business to lose money. Everybody goes into business to make money. But you actually have to be a good citizen within your community, and you can't make money by putting the cost on the back of future generations. So the Brundtland Commission report that goes back 15 years ago that defined sustainability said it's people, planet, and profit, all three. It's not all three, it's not sustainable from a business point of view. And so businesses are getting this kind of backlash, is getting caught up around greenhouse gases and social equity, forgetting the fact that the definition of sustainability means you actually have to make a profit. I use the example at Greenfield Global. We made a superior product that was not recognized in the North American market under regulations. And so we sold it in Europe for even more money. And now North America is catching up to those European standards, and we can sell our product here in North America. But we didn't make the product better to lose money. We made the product better to make more money. We were doing the right thing by our community, by the planet, and by our shareholders. And that's what sustainability is all about. And you're right, the kind of the conservative backlash against woke and against we can't live in a world without fossil fuels. I mean, that the only way to solve that problem is you actually have to transform business. Government has a role to play, the accounting professional has a role to play, but we're not going to solve this problem if the economy, if our standard of living goes down. The voters won't accept that. So you have to be sustainable. You have to get all three going the same way, and it is possible. And the companies that have embraced that are actually, on average, making more money than companies that have decided to be dinosaurs.
I think there's a couple of interesting things that John said, and I have a response, but I'm not sure any of it is sensical. So just kind of humor me as I kind of dance around here. So, like, I think the first thing, like the profit thing, is really important. Like, so, there's not a lot of homegrown Canadian companies anymore. Like, there are some, but comparatively as a jurisdiction, like our ownership our private ownership looks a lot different than a place like Europe. And so parent companies are gonna invest, but there's nothing that ever says that they have to invest in Canada or even North America. Like, they're gonna go where they can make money doing the things that they feel makes them competitive. And so for European parent companies, what makes them competitive is sustainability targets that are real and verified and properly accounted for, etc. And so, like, this notion that, I see this happen all the time, this conversation in Canada, where it's like, well, everyone's dying to invest in Canada. Are they? Maybe. But, they're going to go. It's like, capital's kind of like water, right? It follows the path of least resistance. I think the other thing about, environmentalism and this, woke and all of these other things, like I may be the wrong person to answer this question, because I'm an optimist and an environmentalist. And so, maybe I have a hard time, but, I can understand, the reaction. I live in a part of the province where, like, the Ford F-150, usually with a lift kit, is king. Lloyd, you're not that far from me. You know exactly what I'm talking about. But, like, people care about things like quarries and, resource extraction and these things that are kind of impacting, like, their day-to-day lives and communities. And so, maybe sustainability isn't all about, how we're switching to electrification, But maybe for them, it's about recycled aggregate. And if we have better standards and better ability to recycle aggregate, then maybe we don't have to, virgin mine a quarry pit anymore for aggregate, right? And so I think it's about understanding that everybody cares or sees sustainability different. And maybe it's not about these grandiose net zero targets and talking about carbon pricing and all of these other things. Maybe it's much simpler than that, and it's much more localized than that for people. Those are just my thoughts.
Aaron, you want to chime in? We got about 4 minutes left. So
Yeah, no, I agree. I certainly agree with what's been said. I think that there is this overlap in the cultures of different countries between the sort of general political culture, and the most extreme example is what we're seeing in the US with that kind of polarization. And where government is at, which government plays a really key role in setting that standards and in setting that standard and nudging the market along. The market also nudges government. There's an interplay there. And I think that we are seeing it playing out in different ways in different countries, different continents. And here in Canada, and in the United States, we're seeing this wave of concern about climate, which is pretty much started in 2015. And these waves always ebb and flow. They always end at a higher level where they started, but you want something that's more resilient and not dependent on the government of the day or where public opinion is at that particular moment. And that means things like building it into your corporate structure, your management structure, your decision-making structure. It means having that independent third-party verification of what you're doing. All of those things are going to outlast the flavor of the day, whether it's woke or whether it's the particular stripe of the government of the day.
So I'm going to ask you all, Sarah's already done this, but I'll ask you to repeat it. If you had to give advice to comms professionals in one sentence right now, what would it be? And Sarah, do you want to repeat what you said before?
I think it's about being impeccable, right? Taking the time to do your research and talk with your, sustainability professionals, or, me, I often have to double check things with engineers, right? Going and doing the research and making sure that you understand what's behind the messaging or the statements that you're putting out, and being 100% confident before you hit the go button. And I think you're adding sustainability to the things that you have to do, because people working with companies would have to verify financial statements or mergers or acquisitions or any of these things before they go out, and now it's just that you have to verify and you have to be honest and truthful, because now there are repercussions.
So be impeccable. So be impeccable, John.
Be impeccable.
Well, I would agree with, I was going to say exactly what one of our commenters said, trust but verify. Ronald Reagan had that famous line about nuclear disarmament and the Soviets. Okay, we're going to trust them, but we're going to verify.
Aaron?
If you're a communications
sorry,
professional,
John, we'll let Aaron, we've got a minute left.
If you want to be trusted, claims have to be verified.
No.
Aaron?
Real world results. The commitment's got to be genuine, and it's got to go, the box checking element has to be a bit play. It's got to go way beyond that.
Awesome. Well, thanks everyone, to our guests online, to our guests here in the panel. This went fast. On behalf of Curious Public, thanks so much for joining in. You can find out more about upcoming events in our Comms in Question series by following Curious Public on Instagram and LinkedIn. And to the participants, this will be emailed to you as a link after we wrap up here today. Thanks everyone for joining. Thank you, John. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Aaron, so much for your time and for a great conversation. Take care, everyone.